Good evening. My name is John Volpe. I am a faculty member in the School of Environmental Studies. And on behalf of the University of Victoria community, I'd like to start tonight's proceedings by acknowledging the Coast Salish and the Strait Salish peoples whose traditional lands we meet on tonight. I'd actually like to further acknowledge the growing trend of such acknowledgments that are becoming perfunctory and hollow, words offered in the spirit of political correctness rather than the sincerity of genuine engagement. In the School of Environmental Studies and in UVic, we offer our actions, and most particularly those of our students, as a backdrop and a backstop of these words. So that is to say that talk is cheap, and actions are the real measure of a person or an organization. The School of Environmental Studies is pleased to present this talk by Dr. David Suzuki, a man of unbound action, and on occasion, a few choice words also. I think before we get rolling, I've got a few housekeeping items to take care of. Please, right now, turn your cell phones off. You don't want to be that guy. I'm telling you right now. I'd also like to let you know we're videotaping this talk, and the talk will be available on our website, School of Environmental Studies website, after the talk. Heartbleed willing, it will be available on our website. If you wish to take photographs during the talk, feel free, but please don't use a flash. It's problematic if you're on this end of the equation. If you have one of David's books and you would like them signed, there'll be some time after the talk to allow that to happen also. And finally, like anyone with a vested interest in their own dignity, David can't accept requests for selfies. So, I'm serious. He's serious. So I was tapped tonight to give this introduction for David because of somewhat of a shared history between us. Our initial interactions were years, and we've just realized actually far too many years than we'd like to acknowledge. Years ago, when I was a somewhat hot-headed PhD student embroiled in the salmon farm wars and was in desperate need of some sage guidance to make it through that particular process, particularly in negotiating what is always a dicey proposition, perhaps now more than ever, that of a scientist who's an advocate of evidence-based policy. Years past, our shared interests kept us in each other's orbits. Not long after arriving at UVic here to take up a faculty position, David and Tara's daughter, Severn, arrived at the school to begin a master's degree with our own in-house luminary, Dr. Nancy Turner. And I can honestly say, and sincerely say, that everyone in the school misses Severn. She was a delight and, of course, not surprisingly, a tremendous inspiration. She's a mother now in Haida Gwaii with 2 young kids, keeping her busy. During the same period, I had an opportunity to meet Sev's sister, Sarika, who's a fellow fish geek and is here somewhere, when she was working at UBC in the Fisheries Center. And as David's family continued to grow, so did our family in the School of Environmental Studies. And the orbits continued to maintain alignment. One of the newer additions to the Suzuki clan, David and Tara's son-in-law, Chris Rhodes, has just joined the school to pursue his PhD with one of our newest and brightest additions, Dr. Natalie Ban. And Sarika has also joined us here at UVic, coming on as a visiting scientist at Ocean Networks Canada, while she's also finishing her PhD from the University of York in the UK. So on behalf of the School of Environmental Studies, the Faculty of Social Sciences and the University of Victoria, It's an honor to welcome David and the rest of the family to what we hope you all consider a home away from home. Help me welcome Dr. David Suzuki.
Thank you. Gee, I thought you were introducing me, not the fruit of my loins, but I'm delighted to be here, and I too, although you may think it's perfunctory, I do acknowledge that this is unceded territory of the Coast Salish and the Strait Salish people. I want to thank you all for coming tonight on such a beautiful day, for taking the time to allow me to share a few of my ideas with you this evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And as John mentioned, he's taken the wind out of my introduction. I do feel I have very deep roots and a strong attachment to the University of Victoria. My only nephew graduated from UVic a few years ago. Severn got her master's degree with Nancy Turner. Sarika is a visiting scientist. I don't know if my granddaughter, Midori, are you here, Midori? My granddaughter is in her 4th year here, and my son-in-law is working on his PhD here. So I have a very, very strong attachment and admiration for this university. I also want to acknowledge how proud I am that the students in the University of Victoria are taking this initiative to persuade the university to divest itself of investments in fossil fuel. Well done. Thank you. I'm not here today to speak on behalf of any organization or any group. I'm here as an individual and as an elder. You see, I think that elders have a very special role to play in society. We are past ambitions or temptations for fame or money or power. Now, I know there are a few old people that are still trying to get that. They need help. We should, when you become an elder, you see, we can speak the truth that comes from our hearts because we don't have to fear getting fired or losing a grant or missing out on a promotion. And elders have something no other group in society has. We've lived an entire lifetime. We've made mistakes, suffered failures, celebrated successes and victories. We've learned a lot in that lifetime. And now is the time to sift through our lives for those hard-won lessons that are worth passing on to the younger generations. And that's what I'm here tonight to try to do, to share a few of those ideas. Last week, as you know, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its latest report to tell us with 95% certainty that human use of fossil fuels is changing the chemistry of the atmosphere with enormous repercussions within the biosphere. This report tells us that the impact of climate change is now detectable, is being felt on every continent on this earth. Now, I want you to remember the IPCC is the most credible authority on climate in the world. But I also want you to remember that its reports are very, very conservative because each report has to be vetted through hundreds of scientists and has to ultimately get approval by dozens of countries. So you can bet not only is the science in it going to be good, but it's going to take a very conservative line. This is the latest of years and years of reports telling us that human-induced climate change is real, and we have to act now if we are to avoid catastrophic consequences. Yet when the latest report came out, what were the first comments that came? Oh, this is a strident piece of work. This is alarmist. Since when is it being an alarmist a bad term? You're damn right it's alarmist. They're sounding the alarm that we've held back on doing anything now for 2 decades on this issue. If it's strident, I don't detect that. It's urgent. The urgency comes from years and years of reporting and warning and seeing those warnings fall on deaf ears. I think it's time now then to stop wasting time countering the deniers and the skeptics, most of them paid for or paid to by the fossil fuel industry or right-wing billionaires. It's time to ignore this and get on with facing the reality of what's going on so that we can search for serious solutions. You see, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water. And so we are going to get increasingly extreme, intense storms. And I think that we're already beginning to see that. I certainly felt that this winter in Vancouver. With more atmospheric carbon, that carbon is dissolving at the interface with the oceans, creating carbonic acid and therefore lowering the pH of the oceans. And the planet's most effective carbon capture and storage, which is forests, have been badly destroyed, and the few remaining large forests are now under attack, thereby exacerbating the problems of climate change. We live in a world where everything is connected to everything else, and so whatever is being done in one area has repercussions in others. When I go to Alberta to speak, I tell them, look, I don't give a damn what you do with your tar sands. You go ahead and do anything you want, as long as you keep the consequences in the air and the water in your own province. Then go ahead and do it. Well, of course, it's impossible. And yet, look at what Mr. Harper, our Prime Minister, has said in terms of having a submission to the various environmental assessments over issues like the pipeline. Only those people with a direct interest in this pipeline have the right to talk about it. We all have a direct interest in the consequences of this pipeline. We have a Prime Minister who sees his legacy as creating Canada as a petro superpower. Now, and that drives his agenda. We know what the economic possibilities are with the development of Alberta's tar sands, but this project is the largest industrial development on the planet. Yes, it has huge economic reverberations, but the ecological consequences are every bit as huge. It is astonishing to me that the Harper government, which is my government and your government, not only ignores climate change and the environment as an issue, but demonizes environmentalists as enemies of the country. That this government elected to lead us into the future shuts down research in Canada, shuts down any scientist who is working on some area impinging on the climate issue, muzzles scientists from being open and sharing their knowledge without first being vetted by government. So the question is, if we don't allow science to guide us into a very uncertain future, what do we allow to lead us into the future? The Bible? The Quran? The Fraser Institute? Economists? I believe, corporate executives, we are in deep trouble when the very source of the best information about the state of the planet now is being denied to Canadian people. Of all the industrialized countries, Canada is one of the most vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. We're a northern country, and we know that in the polar areas, the warming is going on at more than twice the rate as it does in temperate or tropical areas. And Inuit have been telling us for over 40 years they can see the consequences of climate change. We have the longest marine coastline of any country in the world. Sea level rise just from thermal expansion, that is, as water warms, it expands. Thermal expansion is going to affect us more than any other country. And when these great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica fall in, we are going to see major, major consequences along our coastlines. And then think of the economic input from those areas that are climate sensitive: agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism, winter sports. These are all being heavily impacted by climate change. So any leader of a country who is ignoring the reality of this on us is, I think, it's a dereliction of responsibility. I believe there is a category in the law called willful blindness, when people in positions of authority deliberately ignore or don't listen to information impinging on their area of authority. They can go to court for willful blindness. And I believe that that's the kind of government we have now. They ought to go to court for willful blindness for the future of our country. Okay. What governments do or do not do in the next few years going to have very little consequence for old folks like me. I'm at the last part of my life. Very little is going to impact. But what is or is not done today is going to reverberate throughout your entire lives. I believe young people have the greatest stake in what is or is not being done today. Yet youth today have the lowest participation rate in the electoral process. And here's a challenge to young people. It's your future. You've got, if you care about your future, you've got to get involved in the legislative or the electoral process. And that's why all of the controversy over the Elections Act is so important. Because if Mr. Poilievre, or whatever his arrogant name is, if he's allowed to ram this thing through, it means that young people, particularly, as well as First Nations and poor, are going to have less chance at participating in this democratic process. It's your future. You've got to get involved for your own sake. And I would suggest the first challenge for all of you young folks is to recruit the two most important people on the planet, your mother and dad. They have to become eco-warriors on your behalf. And I get young people that say, my dad thinks I'm full of shit about climate change. Well, if we can't convince dad and mom, how the hell are we going to convince the rest of the world? That is your first assignment. Mom and dad have to be eco-warriors on your behalf. Eminent scientists today, like James Hansen, have said 350 parts per million of carbon in the air is the maximum we can allow if we want to have any possibility of not going into catastrophic climate change. We're at 400 today and on our way to 450 or even 500 if we don't slow down and reverse the rate of fossil fuel use today. What is clearly needed then is that we have to get off fossil fuels. It's as simple as that. Now, as you well know, Canada has a horrific international reputation. At every climate conference, we've been the ones trying to sabotage the meetings. We've been called the fossil country of the week, of the month, of the year. We are one of the intransigent countries. But at Copenhagen, we agreed with everybody there. We must not allow emissions that will increase temperature above 2 degrees. Politicians love promises like that. They promise not to do anything to increase temperature above 2 degrees by the end of this century. Mr. Harper knows darn well he's not going to be around. If you don't make it, tough, he's dead. It doesn't matter. So politicians love these things so far ahead. But by committing to preventing anything above 2 degrees, they've made a huge commitment. We know how much more carbon we can allow to accumulate in the atmosphere before we have to stop. The cutoff to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. And that number turns out to be 565 gigatons of carbon, and that's it. Now that number doesn't mean anything to me. The important thing to remember is we've got 5 times that much carbon that we already know is in the ground. So if we can only allow 565 gigatons to be emitted until the end of this century. That means that over 80% of the carbon reserves we have to be left in the ground. So that means, what's the argument about trains versus pipelines? We've got to shut them all down. There's no argument over the tar sands. It's got to be left in the ground. It took nature tens and hundreds of millions of years to capture that carbon and stick it into the ground. It's crazy to say, oh, we're going to get it out, burn it, oh, and then we'll get the carbon and put it back in. Nature already did it for us. Leave it in the ground. And that's the challenge of the promise our Prime Minister has made at Copenhagen. We won't do anything to ramp up the temperature rise above 2 degrees. That means we've got to get off carbon very, very quickly. We've already, many of course argue that, well, the problem's too big. We're not going to do it. And so we're left with only one thing, and that is we've got to take control and we've got to engineer the atmosphere. Geoengineering is our great thing. We're so good, we're so smart. We may have screwed up the planet, but now we're going to correct it. We're going to erect huge umbrellas in the sky and shield the planet from the sun. Or we're going to spray sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere as an aerosol and reflect light off the earth. Or we're going to capture the carbon and stick it in the ground as carbon capture and storage. It's insane when we've already wreaked so much damage to think that we're just going to keep adding more engineering and solve the problem that engineering and technology created. Climate change, as you know, is just one of a suite of problems that human beings have created today. We are exceeding the boundaries of many of nature's limits or capacity to regenerate itself: overfishing, deforestation, toxic pollution, endocrine disruptors. I can go down a whole list of problems we've created. And I advise every one of you, if you haven't read it, read Elizabeth Kolbert's marvelous book, The Sixth Extinction, which is all about the extinction crisis that we're facing today. How have we come to this terrible moment in time? This is the moment when the very fate of our species is going to be determined in the next few years. Well, I'm a biologist and a geneticist, and I've been very impressed with the way scientists are able to take DNA, the genetic material, and use that to trace the movement of human beings across the planet over time. And all of the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. And I can't wait to be invited by the Ku Klux Klan to give a lecture. And I'll tell these pointy-headed characters, we're all Africans, for Christ's sake. What's the problem? We are Africans. That's where we were born. Try to imagine what the world was like when we were born as a species. I mean, if you think of the Serengeti, 150,000 years ago, it must have been filled with animals in abundance and variety beyond anything that we would ever see in the Serengeti today. And you'd have to look very carefully to spot the little clumps of 3, 4, or 5 of these funny-looking, two-legged, furless apes. And that was us. And I'm sure back then, no other species looked at their kids and went, shh, don't disturb him. He's going to take over the planet. I mean, what did we have going for us? We weren't very big or strong or fast. There weren't many of us. We weren't endowed with special sensory ability. What would allow this two-legged ape to take over the planet in 150 millennia? Well, the answer, of course, is that our secret, our advantage, was invisible. It was a 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls. It was a human brain that more than compensated for our lack of physical or sensory ability. That brain, according to Nobel Prize winner François Jacob, the human brain has an inbuilt, innate need for order. We don't like it when things happen and we don't understand what's going on. So we have an automatic impulse to try to create order in the world around. Now, we always had big fudge factors called gods and stuff, but we were able to develop worldviews that made sense to us. That brain made us very, very curious. We were inventive. We learned through trial and error and observation and we remembered. So I believe that curiosity, inventiveness, and memory were really key parts of our advantage. And that brain did something no other animal has done. It created a concept called the future. The future doesn't exist. The only thing that's real is now and what we remember from the past. But because we invented the notion of a future, we are the only animal that realized, based on our knowledge and experience, we could look ahead and see where the dangers lie, where the opportunities are. And we could determine our fate in the future by acting now. We could take action to avoid danger and exploit opportunity. I believe foresight was our great human advantage. It gave us a leg up over all other creatures and allowed us to reach the position that we're in today. Foresight, the ability to look ahead. And now we have all of the amplified ability to look ahead. We have scientists, we have engineers, we have supercomputers. And for over 40 years, acting in the best tradition of our species, scientists have been telling us that we are heading down a very dangerous path, that there are opportunities from changing direction and following a different course. Let me give you an example of the kind of warnings that have come down. This is one. I hope every one of you knows about this. It was released in November of 1992. It's called World Scientists Warning to Humanity, and it's signed by more than 1,400 scientists from 71 countries in the world. It includes more than half of all Nobel Prize winners that were alive in 1992. So that's a pretty eminent group of scientists. What were they warning us about in 1992? Let me read a few of the lines. Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to support life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. 1992. They then go on and list the areas of collision. This is the atmosphere, is it right at the top? Water resources, oceans, soil, forests, species extinction, and overpopulation. And then the words grow even more bleak. No more than one or a few decades remain. This is 1992. Before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost, and the prospects for humanity immeasurably diminished. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. And then they list the 5 things that have to be started immediately. This is a frightening document. Scientists of this stature don't go around signing documents this strongly worded as a rule. But if this is a frightening document, the response of the media around the world was terrifying. There was no response. At that time, we had one national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, and our national broadcaster, the CBC, didn't bother to report it. Excuse me, half of all Nobel Prize winners telling us we could have as little as 10 years to avoid catastrophe, and this is not newsworthy? And I want you to think of what you see on the business page every day. I mean, a businessman just has to fart and it'll get full-page headlines. What's going on here? This is, to me, a very frightening thing. Why can't we see what these scientists are warning us about? I think part of the problem is things have happened so suddenly, we simply haven't come to grips with what an enormous impact. We still get people who say, you know, human beings couldn't possibly affect something like the climate. We haven't come to understand how powerful we've become, and it's happened, as I say, very suddenly. If humans have been around as a species for 150,000 years, for 99% of that time, there were never 1 billion human beings. We reached 1 billion for the first time in the very early 1800s. I was born in 1936 when there were just over 2 billion people. And yet, in my lifetime, the population of the planet has more than tripled. Every year, we're still adding the equivalent of 3 times Canada's population to the planet. And every human being has to drink water, eat food, breathe the air, clothe and shelter ourselves. Just the act of staying alive, because there are so many of us, means we have a very large ecological footprint. It takes a lot of air, water, and land to keep us alive. But of course, we're not like a rat or a rabbit or a mouse. We have an enormous amount of technology used on our behalf. I mean, I look around the room and I see people in woolen sweaters and cotton shirts. I'm sure none of you here in this audience grows a field of cotton plants or a flock of sheep. Technology enables us to grow products like this, things like this in other countries, manufacture, transport, and we can accumulate them from around the world. Technology used on our behalf is able to spread our footprint right around the planet and increases our take of materials out of the earth. So that amplifies our ecological footprint. And ever since the end of World War II, we've been afflicted with a heavy appetite for stuff. We love to go and shop. 97% of American teenage girls call shopping their #1 recreation. So not only do you have fun, I guess you exercise as you're going from store to store. We love to shop, and everything that we buy has to come out of the earth. And when we're finished with it, we'll go back into the earth. My mom and dad became adults during the Great Depression of the 30s, and people suffered a tremendous amount. And because of that, we were taught certain homilies over and over again. You know, save some for tomorrow, live within your means. You need money to buy the necessities in life, but you don't run after money as if having more money or stuff makes you a better person. Share, don't be greedy. Help your neighbor, you may one day need their help. These are the kinds of lessons that they distilled out of the experience of the Great Depression. We've forgotten those a long time ago. Just try to go to Walmart's. Well, don't try to go to Walmart's. But if you ever go to Walmart, just look at the number of items that you think you absolutely need in order to live, I won't say at a minimal level, but what you'd call a necessity in life. My bet is 99% of what's there has nothing to do with the necessities of life. That's what our great economy has created. And we have a global economy now that uses the entire world as a source of raw materials, uses the entire world to dump its toxic chemicals and waste. So when you add all of that up, which happened very, very suddenly, when you add our numbers, our technology, our consumption, and our global economy, we have become a new kind of force on the planet. Our species is changing the properties and the function of the biological, chemical, and physical features of the planet on a geological scale. No other species has ever been able to do that, and we're doing it with explosive speed. That's why scientists now refer to this period as the Anthropocene. I know some people will call it the Anthropocene, I don't care. It's the human age, when we, human beings, have become a geological force on the earth. Well, I'm still asked, why can't we see that? I mean, we're educated, we see the media, we must know the impact we're having on earth. And here I think we've become blind perceptually to reality. You see, for 95% of our existence, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We had to carry everything we owned on our backs, and we had to follow plants and animals through the seasons, wherever they were. When you're a hunter-gatherer, you know darn well you depend on nature. that nature is the source of your survival and well-being. 10,000 years ago, we begin the agricultural revolution. Human beings underwent this huge shift in the way that we live. In 1900, when there were 1.6 billion people in the world, there were only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. London was the largest with 6.5 million people. Tokyo was the 7th largest, 1.5 million people. The vast majority of people around the world, including in Canada and the United States, lived in rural village communities because most people in 1900 were involved in some aspect of agriculture. And when you're a farmer, you know very well weather and climate determine everything about whether you're going to survive from year to year. We know in Canada the amount of snow in the winter is directly related to the amount of moisture in the soil in the summer. We know insects are important to pollinate flowering plants. Certain species of plants will take nitrogen from the air and fix it as fertilizer in the soil. Farmers understand we are a part of and dependent on nature. But in the last 100 years, we've undergone this unbelievable shift in the way that we live. By the year 2000, there were now 6 billion people in the planet, 4 times as many as there were in 1900. But in the year 2000, there were more than 400 cities with more than 1 million people. The 10 largest all had more than 11 million people. Tokyo was the largest city in the world, 26 million people. So in countries like in the industrialized world, most of us now live in big cities. We think of Canada as this vast empty space, but the reality is Canadians are clustered along the border with the United States, and we live in big cities. And in a big city, your highest priority becomes your job. You need a job to earn the money to buy the things you want. And so the economy then in a city comes to be seen as our highest priority. I have a friend who lives in the north end of Toronto, and he told me that he lives in a high-rise apartment that's completely air-conditioned. When he goes to work, he goes down the elevator into the basement, gets into his air-conditioned car, drives down the Don Valley Freeway into the basement of his commercial building, up into his office, all air-conditioned, connected from that building through tunnels to all kinds of shopping areas. He said, you know, Dave, I don't have to go outside for weeks. You think about that, and it's no wonder then that today the average Canadian child spends 8 minutes a day outside and over 6 hours a day in front of a television, computer, or cell phone screen. So nature has become distanced from our lives, and so it becomes easy to think, well, as long as we've got a few parks to go out and play and camp in, who needs nature? My highest priority is my job, because that's what allows me to live as we do. Another problem with that, though, is that we've become separated from nature, so we can't see that we're a part of that world. But the globalized economy itself blinds us to much of the ecological and social impact of what's going on. If you go out to buy a cotton shirt, how many of you have ever asked, is this organic? Because we don't think that cotton, the growing of cotton, is one of the most chemically intensive crops in agriculture. So, and if you look at the impact in the largest cotton growing area of the world, which is in Eurasia around the Aral Sea, and I've been there to film the consequences, it is an ecological and a social disaster because of the high use of chemicals and the application of all of the fresh water onto the cotton fields. It's been totally disastrous. But when we pay money in a store here in Canada, we have no concept that what we are doing is contributing to an ecological and social disaster somewhere else in the world. Same thing, you buy a car, you buy a bike, you buy a cell phone. Do you ever ask, gee, mining is one of the most destructive activities we undergo. Where did all the metals in these products, where did they come from? We don't ask that. We just want a name brand. We want good quality. We pay our money, buy it, and drive it away or use it at home or whatever. And yet the act of purchase of that product has reverberations that go out all around the world. So the globalized economy disconnects us from the the indirect consequences of the products that we're purchasing. So add that to the fact that we're spending less and less time outside because we live in big cities, then you see that we are no longer aware of the impact of what we do in our lives on the rest of the world. But there is something else, I think, that's very, very important in our failure to see what's going on around. I, like millions of people, I was swept into the environmental movement by a book by Rachel Carson in 1962 called Silent Spring. And that book really, for many of us, was a turning point. Up until that time, we thought technology and science, they were great, and onward and upward, and life is going to get better and better for everybody through science. But what she said, or pointed out in her book, was that using science, we fragment the world. We can't see the whole big picture. And in the real world, everything is connected. So you spray DDT on fields to kill insects, and you end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. And that was a very, very important book that swept millions of people in the modern environmental movement. When that book came out, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. The word environment in 1962 simply didn't mean what we have come to understand it today. And of course, that movement was unbelievably successful. I mean, because of the awareness that Rachel Carson brought on us, huge movement in 10 years. The United Nations Environment Program was set up, first environmental conference in Stockholm. We've got environment departments at all levels of government now around the world, and laws to protect air and water and soil and endangered species, and millions of hectares of wilderness protected as parks and reserves, all because of that environmental movement, which was a very, very powerful force in the 60s and the 70s. Now, some of the kinds of issues I was involved in from British Columbia, where there was a proposal, I'm sure, well, maybe a few people here will remember, there was a proposal to drill for oil in Hecate Strait. And, oh, Vicky remembers, yeah. And I joined with OSAN, which is an Aboriginal group, to fight that, and we stopped it. There was a proposal to build a dam at Site C on the Peace River, and we stopped that. Americans wanted to bring supertankers from Alaska, from the North Slope, down through British Columbia waters to Seattle and refine it there. And David Anderson was one of the leaders, is a leader of the Liberal Party in BC at that time, fighting and stopping the movement of the supertankers. And Tara and I, my wife and I, joined with the Kayapo in fighting a big loan from the World Bank, $500 million, to be given to the Brazilian government to build a dam, Cararau, near Altamira in Brazil. And we fought that and we stopped it. The World Bank pulled its loan back. And year after year, the Alaskans kept trying to attach a rider to legislation. This is an arcane bit of trickery that Americans used to slip things into their bills. They'd put a rider to allow drilling for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd. And every time the threat seemed to come up, at the nature of things, we ramped up and did a story about the porcupine caribou herd. And each time, a huge movement of environmentalists, and we stopped it every time there was a movement to drill in this very sensitive area of Alaska. So there were great successes, and we celebrated these victories. But you know what? 35 years later, we are fighting exactly the same battles again. You've all heard of Sarah Palin, drill, baby, drill. There's still pressure to drill in Hecate Strait, But certainly we want to have a pipeline going to Kitimat and take bitumen out through the BC coast. The dam at Altamira is going to be built because Brazilians are doing so well. They don't need the World Bank loan anymore. And you all know that British Columbia and Christy Clark are cranked up now to start building the dam at Site C. So what is going on here? We thought we won victories, but I believe environmentalism fundamentally failed because we didn't shift the paradigm. We didn't shift the arena in which the discussion was being made. We didn't change the way people looked at the issues. So over and over again then, we end up fighting the same issues. And the key, I think, is this. My grandparents came to Canada from Japan between 1904 and 1906. My dad was born in Vancouver in 1909, my mother in 1911. My mother and dad, and all the other Japanese Canadian kids born in Canada at that time, had no grandparents and no elders. They were all back in Japan. When my grandparents left Japan, they never thought they would ever go back again. They came because they were so poor, and they came for opportunities. But they grew a generation, raised a generation of young people that had no roots in this country. They were the rootless generation because elders and grandparents had left back at home. Now you think about indigenous people around the world. They were like us at one time. They came to new territory, and I'm sure they screwed up like everybody else, killed off the easy, slow-moving animals or cut down the easy-to-get plants and suddenly discovered, oh my God, they're gone. But over hundreds and thousands of years, indigenous cultures learned to live in balance with their territory. If they didn't, they moved on. Well, we can't move on anywhere today. But it's not that they're somehow being indigenous means you have this inborn understanding. That their understanding of our place was learned through countless generations of their forebears. So around the world, I have found indigenous people have the sense that the earth is sacred, that land is sacred. And then I think of my grandparents. My grandparents came here because they were dirt poor, and they regarded this as an uncivilized country. My father, who was born and raised in Canada, used to say, when the English people were picking food up with their bare hands and eating it, Japanese were eating off fine china with ivory chopsticks. Maybe that's why the elephants are gone. But he was trying to contrast the different cultures. My grandparents came here because they were impoverished. They came for opportunity. They had no roots in the land, and so they saw this as a resource. They saw this as an opportunity. Work hard to get the money to buy land, and then if there are fish on it, catch them and sell them. If there are trees on it, cut them and sell them. If there are minerals in it, dig them up and sell them. And then when you've developed your property, sell it and move somewhere else. So you see, that sense of what land is fundamentally different from the indigenous cultures. And that, I believe, is reflected around the world, that the colonizing countries came to new lands with no roots at all. They had no respect for the indigenous people, so they didn't learn a damn thing from them. And they simply imposed a way of looking at land that has now become the dominant way. I don't think it's an accident that as you look across Canada today, the battles that are going on, I've been to LC Buktuk, where the Mi'kmaq are fighting against fracking because it's about water. I just came back from Nemaska in northern Quebec with the Cree, where they're educating their young people about the battle against Hydro-Quebec and the need to protect the land and the water there. We know about the battle of the dozens of communities throughout the greatest forest on the planet, left on the planet, the boreal forest. Those are indigenous communities that are fighting to protect the forest. If you go to Fort Chipewyan and look downstream from the Alberta tar sands, they are fighting for their future, for their water, and for their muskrat, which are a part of their culture. And then you come to the coast of British Columbia. The 9 communities along the coast, Tara and I have visited every one of them, Tara, many, many times. And the first thing they tell you when you go into these communities is, we need jobs. We need community economic development. They're incredibly poor and they need economic development. You can bet the government and Enbridge have offered those communities millions of dollars. All they have to do is sign on the line and say, we'll let your pipeline through our territory. And they are 100% opposed to Enbridge's Northern Gateway. What are they telling us? There are things more important than money. And our government and our corporations don't seem to get it. That's what the issue is. It's about fighting for a different way of seeing our place on the planet. And so that is what the challenge is today. So how much can I take another 5 minutes? So where do we go? What do we do then? Let me just tell you a couple of stories. During the 70s and 80s, in British Columbia, battles over forests were the big deal. We were all, right, Vicki? We can show all the scars on our backs and our fronts in those battles. And the solution of our government to those battles was, we'll set up roundtables. We'll set up roundtables where all of the stakeholders in the future of these forests could come together. So you get the forest companies, you get the enviros, you get the tourism, you get the First Nations, and you're all equal as stakeholders. And then what you did was duke it out. Now, there might be compromises made by everybody, and you get a decision that doesn't please anybody, or you get a winner and a loser. And I just think that is a lousy way to deal with issues like forests. So that's story number one. We used a completely wrong way of dealing with these contentious issues by acting as if there were different stakeholders and you could rank which ones were more important than the other. A few years back, the Lytton Indian Band asked if I would help them fight to prevent logging in what they considered a sacred valley, the Stein Valley. The British Columbia government had given a logging license to Fletcher Challenge, New Zealand Forest Company, and the Lytton people were determined not to allow the logging. And then at one point I encountered by accident the CEO of Fletcher Challenge. And when I came around, I thought, oh my God, this guy is a CEO of the company that wants to go into the Stein Valley. And very quickly he realized, oh my God, that's that shit disturber David Suzuki. And needless to say, as we started to talk, our voices got louder and louder. And finally, in a fit of frustration, he screamed at me, listen, Suzuki, are tree huggers like you willing to pay for those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay for those trees, they don't have any value till someone cuts them down. And that for me was my epiphany, because I realized that so long as we continue to argue in the economic realm, we're going to lose every time. Because what environment, the CEO of Fletcher Challenge could say, I've got this many jobs, this much money will come in, this many cubic feet of pulp, this many board feet of lumber. What have you got? And people like Vicki and me are going around, well, we could pick some berries, and maybe we could cut some salal and give it to the florists, and mushrooms, yeah, and maybe we'll find a cure for cancer. But you see, the problem is, the reason we're fighting for the forest is not economic. It's that the forest, as long as it's intact and healthy, is performing services that keep the biosphere healthy for an animal like us. Those trees are taking carbon out of the air and putting oxygen back in it. Not a bad service for an animal like us. If they didn't do it, we wouldn't be here. You know what economists call that? It's an externality. It's not in the economy. Those trees pump millions of gallons of water into the atmosphere and moderate weather and climate. It's an externality. The trees, the roots hold the soil, so when it rains, they don't run into the spawning grounds of the salmon and spoil them. It's an externality. The forest provides habitat for countless other organisms, insects, birds, mammals. All of those things are of no economic consequence. And so when we try to argue with the CEO in front of a politician, our arms are tied behind our back because we're discussing different things. And that came through to me very clearly when the Nature of Things decided to do a 2-hour special on forestry. We wanted to compare Canadian forestry practices with the practices in Europe and in Japan. And at one point I arranged for Macmillan Blodell to let 3 loggers in a cut block near Ucluelet to come and be interviewed. So we drove up in a truck, and as we got our gear out, they saw us and they came out of the forest, 3 great big guys. And they're going, "You goddamn environmental," and we're yelling back, and it was great television. And so we argued back and forth. But at the end of it, I said, "Listen, guys, I don't know of a single environmentalist who's against logging. We use paper. You know, we need wood. We're not against logging. We just want to be sure your children and grandchildren will be able to cut trees as rich as the ones you're cutting down now." Right away, one of the guys jumps in. "No way, my kids are going into logging. There won't be any trees left." So you realize that we're not talking to each other. What they're concerned with is being able to put food on the plate every week and to make their car payments and meet their mortgages every month. They're arguing a different thing when environmentalists are talking about the ecological role that forests play and the sustainability of that role, for including jobs for loggers forever. So we've got to get our discussion together, but we cannot allow the economy to dictate the terms of our discussion. So a couple of years ago, a man named Marcel Coutu called me and said, "Could I come and speak to you?" And Marcel Coutu was the CEO of a consortium of all of the largest oil companies in Alberta's tar sands. He's a biggie. So I said, "Sure, come on ahead, I'd be glad to see you." So he flew down the next day, came to my office, and I said, "Marcel, glad to meet you. But look, I don't want to fight with you. I don't want to argue with you. There's no point." I said, "I want you to leave your identity, your profession, outside the door, and I will too. I want to meet you human being to human being, and I want to begin our discussion by what we agree on. If we can't agree on anything fundamental, then everything is going to be a fight, and that simply doesn't make it as far as I'm concerned." So I suggested this. I'll throw out a suggestion, then you respond and tell me whether I'm full of shit or not. So I said, we live in a world that is shaped and determined through laws of science, laws of nature. In physics, physics tells us we can't build a rocket that will move faster than the speed of light. Nobody talks about that except a science fiction writer. We accept that. We can't build a machine on Earth that is an anti-gravity machine. We know that. And we can't, because of the laws of thermodynamics, we can't build a perpetual motion machine. Everybody understands that. That's dictated to us by the laws of physics. Chemistry is the same. The atomic properties of each element tells us what kind of reactions are possible, what kinds of molecules can be synthesized, what's not possible, and there are diffusion rates and temperature effects that determine the way we can carry out chemical reactions. We live with that. We know that. And in biology, it's the same. We are animals. And as animals, that dictates certain fundamental realities. Now, what has surprised me is how many people get mad when I say we are animals. I gave a talk in Austin, Texas, back in the 1990s. There was a huge audience, but a lot of children, and I said, "Now, kids, if there's one thing you remember from my talk, remember we are animals." Man, their parents are just so pissed off. "Don't you call my daughter an animal, we're human beings." You know, and you can see our attitude. You know, if you call someone a chicken or a pig or a worm or a snake or an ape, these are all insults, right? Because somehow we think we're different from these creatures. I went to a store in Calgary many years ago, and there was a big sign in the front. It said, "No animals allowed." So as a kind of a joke, I went in to seek the owner, and I said, you know, if you enforce that, you're not going to have any customers. Now, what was really shocking and frightening to me is he thought I was crazy. He didn't know what I was talking about. We are animals. And as animals, surely, Mr. Coutu, our very survival and well-being depends on air. From the moment we leave our mother's body to the last breath we take before we die, we need air every minute of our lives. If you don't have air for more than 3 or 4 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air all the time, you're sick. And I hope you've been seeing the statistics coming out of China now. They're horrifying. Was it 250,000 Chinese or more dying of air pollution alone? Anyway, we are created by air. So surely air, protecting pure, clean air, should be one of our highest priorities. You can't go for more than 3 or 4 days without water. If you have to drink polluted water, you get sick. So clean water should be another one of our highest priorities. We can go for weeks without eating. Some of us could probably go for a month or two. But sooner or later, you'll kick the bucket if you don't have food. And most of that comes from the soil. We need that. Isn't that a fundamental thing? And every bit of the energy in our bodies that we need to move and grow and reproduce, all of that is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants through photosynthesis, converted into chemical energy. So surely, Mr. Coutu, is what I told him, protection of clean air, clean water, clean soil, and sunlight through photosynthesis, and the diverse animals and plants that deliver those to us, must be the foundation of the way we live. If we don't protect those things, we're either very unhealthy or we die. And so I asked him then if he could agree with that. Then we could begin to ask, how do we develop an economy? How do we develop a culture and a society where we can lead rich, full lives while being founded on protecting these fundamental needs? He didn't say much. He left and I never heard from him again. But somehow it seems to me, if we don't carry on this discussion through that context, we're going to have a very hard time coming up with any simple solution. Those are things determined by laws of science, nature. There are other things, though. We draw lines around property, around cities, around provinces, around countries. We take those lines, man, do we take them seriously. In Texas, if someone comes onto your property, you can shoot and kill them. It's legal to do that. We go to war, and we will kill and die to protect these boundaries. But you know what? Air doesn't care about our boundaries. Nature couldn't care 2 hoots about our boundaries. Look at Copenhagen. 192 countries trying to deal with the atmosphere that doesn't belong to anyone through the lenses of 192 national boundaries and 192 economies. And what we're trying to do is shoehorn nature into our priorities. It doesn't work that way. Nature moves according to different rules. And we can't attempt to impose our creations on nature. We've got to learn to live with nature's needs. Now, we do other things. We create concepts like capitalism, economics, corporations, markets. And man, do we take those things seriously. I was talking to Preston Manning a few years ago, and we were having a great discussion, and I said, market, and he went, market, the market, hallelujah, praise the market, free the market, let the market do it. What the hell? We invented the damn thing. That's crazy to suddenly act as if the market is this thing that is going to determine the whole fate of humanity. You know, a few hundred years ago, people believed in dragons, demons, and monsters. I mean, we believed in them. We gave them gold and jewels just to keep them off our backs. But today, nobody believes in dragons or demons. I mean, we know those are figments of our imagination. But what do? we replace them with another figment of our imagination called the economy. This is crazy. We can't change nature, but we can change the things we create. And yet we're so pumped up with how smart we are, we let our creations determine the kind of conversations that we are having. And that is going to lead us into the terrible catastrophe we seem headed now. It's time to talk about the big changes. And I think we start by acknowledging that we're human beings, that we have fundamental needs that all people should be guaranteed, and then go about designing a society and an economy and a culture that can live by protecting them. And I believe it is going to be indigenous people around the world that we're going to look to and say, give us some guidance in how to do this. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is open for questions. I'm sure there's going to be a lot. We have 2 mics in the room on either end. And what we'll do is, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, make an indication. I'll keep track up here, and then we will bring the mic to you. I'd also ask, given the number of the people in the room, that you think about your questions and try to make them concise, because we do want to make sure everybody gets a chance, and we get through as many as possible.
Was that a question, or are you? Oh, there's one way at the back.
We've also got somebody just here
at the
mic if we want to just get started.
One thing you said during your talk, that 80% of all carbon reserves have to stay underground to maintain a livable climate. I'm wondering, in that context, do you think it's ethical to profit from investments in fossil fuel companies?
Well, I think that, no, I don't. I don't think so at all. That's what the divestment campaign is all about. In the same way that we campaigned against investing in South Africa, it's the same thing today. I don't think it's ethical at all. Although Ezra Levant would have you believe there's ethical oil, which is, you know, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, but there you have it. But I don't think that we should be spending a cent subsidizing. We subsidize the most profitable area in all of society to the tune of $1.5 billion a year. We subsidize them. And yet, you know, we plead, we're broke. We can't spend money for public transit or renewable energy or any of that. We're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. We shouldn't be doing any more exploration for oil because we've got to leave most of it in the ground. We've got to put a price on carbon that we do burn, and I believe it should start way above $50 a ton, and we should be moving up to $150 to $200 a ton very, very quickly. And we've got to start a program of getting to 100% renewable electricity within 10 years. That's what Al Gore called for years ago. But that's how serious the problem is, and we have to get on to it. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes because this reminds me of a very important thing. I was starting my last year in college in the United States in 1957. And on October 4th, 1957, anybody know what happened that day? Sputnik. We didn't know there was a space program. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik. This is when the Cold War was on, and Russia seemed very, very powerful and was going into Africa and Southeast Asia. And the Americans very quickly cranked up their rockets, and they had 3, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Every one of the American rockets blew up on the launch pad or got off the ground and blew up. Meanwhile, the Russians launched the first animal, a dog, Laika, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, the first team of cosmonauts, the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. And we realized, wow, they're really advanced in science and technology. Americans didn't roll over and say, oh, we can't afford to catch up. I mean, they're too far ahead. This will break the economy. They just said, we got to beat these guys, and they cranked. And it was glorious. Here I was a Canadian, and all you had to do was say, oh, well, I like science, and they threw money at you. It was just a glorious time for science. And in 1961, Kennedy said, we're going to race the Russians to the moon. Now, think of the consequence of that commitment. Nobody knew how the hell they were going to do it. They just made the commitment to beat the Russians to the moon. Not only were the U.S. the only country to land people on the moon, but all of the things that fell out of it, no one anticipated. GPS, cell phones, 24-hour-a-day newscasts, all kinds of things resulted from that simple commitment. And this year, as has been for the last 50 years, when Nobel Prizes are given out, guess who gets most of them? Americans. Because 50 years ago, America said, we make the commitment to beat these guys to the moon. And I tell Americans, it's un-American to say it can't be done. That's not the American way. And yet to listen to the whining and moaning about climate change and what to do, this is not an American way to say, no, it'll destroy the economy. And so we've got to challenge them and Canadians to make the commitment and reap the benefits that will come as a result. Sorry.
Thank you very much. My question is about science communication across political barriers. You could take someone who has, say, a conservative ideology and tell them the AAAS...
You take them, I don't.
Well, the WHO, every National Academy of Science agrees climate change is occurring, and social psychologists have shown that they'll just come up with more and more inventive ways to try to shut that out. Similarly, you could take someone who's a progressive, tell them, AAAS, National Academy of Science, all these people say GM foods are safe, and they'll come up with ways to say, oh no, that this is, I'll get that out of the way. I'll try to deal with that without addressing the evidence. How is it that we can, with your knowledge as a science communicator, how is it that we can best go ahead and communicate across these lines where it seems we have very powerful innate mechanisms to try to reject evidence that from outside of our values, outside of our political basis?
I think you've identified what to me is the most crucial thing. I did my first television series in 1962. And I felt that science was too important to leave just to corporations or politicians, that the public had to take ownership or had to be involved at least so that the public can have some input into how science would be applied. Most of the arrows in my body from opposition came from my fellow scientists. Most of them are in my back, not my front, because usually criticism came through my students, which made me feel doubly bad. Well, the chickens come home to roost. If scientists want to do their elite thing and think, well, we can appeal to politicians to get more money and not bother to explain to Canadians why science matters and how science differs from other ways of knowing, the consequence, we're paying the price now. We've got to be willing to speak out. I tried to form about 10 years ago a group which I called the Canary Club, the canary warning in the coal mine. And this is a group of eminent scientists who would be willing to speak out, even if some event came up, a spill in the Gulf, would be willing to speak in terms of basic scientific concepts, make a generalization, and speak out. That was the idea. People loved the idea, but they wanted me to do it, and I was too busy with my foundation. But I think that what we need is more scientists willing to get up and speak out at all levels. Go to little groups of natural history clubs, or go to the B'nai B'rith. The first public lecture I gave in Vancouver was to the B'nai B'rith. We've got to speak out and talk about our activity, because what we're talking about affects everyone. This is a very frightening time if you read Chris Turner's book, The War on Science, to see it all documented, what Harper is now doing, is really terrifying. It's terrifying for the reason that Alan Gregg documents. You should Google Alan Gregg and his speech at the University of Ottawa about 1.5 years ago. But he talks about the book 1984, when George Orwell predicted that newspeak, which is when people buy into newspeak, you can tell them black is white or war is peace, and if they accept that, then they'll accept anything. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. And you just have to read, it's a brilliant speech by Alan Gregg. It's a frightening time.
At the beginning of your speech, you said that we should stop trying to convince the skeptics of global warming. Yet the government has so many skeptics in it. Why shouldn't we try to convince them? Because they're ruling our country, they're making all the big decisions, so why shouldn't we try to convince them?
Very good question. I have spent a lot of my time lobbying government. So, you know, because I was very concerned about how poorly science was funded back in the 60s. So every time there was a Minister of State for Science and Technology, I'd make a point of going to see them, trying to educate some guy that didn't give a damn about science. He'd been stuck in this little minor portfolio, couldn't wait to get out of it. Try to educate him to understand about science. And by the time they were educated, they'd get moved to a different portfolio. We'd have to start all over again. We need to have science being as important to us as a part of our culture as reading, writing, and arithmetic. That starts in the early years. We're not going to convince, I just don't think there's much hope that you're going to take someone like Mr. Harper and educate him about climate change and get him to change. It's just not, he's not interested, and it's not worth putting out any energy. This has got to be the public that comes to understand that.
Also, there's so many ways around us to create energy. Like, say, lights. You could put a solar panel close to a light, a small solar panel, and use that to then power the light. You'd still be creating light.
Where does the light come from?
Other such things, you could actually harness a way to make energy from something, and you would still be getting that from it. Say, the turning of a car wheel, and then you use that to partially power the car.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. First of all, I don't think you can take light that's created by something, by hydropower or whatever, and you can certainly use that to recover some of the light, but you'll never get as much light back out, energy. So that's not the way to go, but I see what you're saying. You know, when you think that when we're driving along the road or we put the brakes on, we can now invent technology to recover that in the car. But maybe there's a way to recover what we do on the road, from the road. I've got a very simple thing in my house, which is when you do your dishes or take a shower and that warm water goes down the drain, we've already put the energy into warming that water. And when you put that down the drain, that's energy that you've invested in going to waste. And if you wrap a simple copper tube around your wastewater outlet, you can recover much of that heat back and put it back into water. So, and what you're saying, I think, is absolutely right on. Look at all the ways that we ourselves are generating and wasting energy. I mean, I go to the gym and I see these guys on bikes pedaling away. Why the hell don't we hook that up to batteries or something and make use of it, right? And so, yeah, I think we've got to get much more clever about the way that we harvest. The way I want a city to be designed in the future is if you fly over the city, you won't be able to see it, because every bit of space will be like a forest where all of our needles and leaves are supplicating the sun, saying, please, thank you for the generosity of your light. We ought to have solar panels, all sizes and shapes, just harvesting that sun. When you see a bare wall, a bare roof, that's just such a wasted opportunity. Sunlight is streaming onto that. Water is streaming onto that. We ought to harvest all that. We call ourselves an intelligent species. We haven't even started to apply that intelligence.
Hello. So there's a large social component to your paradigm shift, I noticed. And you were talking about how we can meet on common ground about preserving the species or making a better future for children. But what about people who don't care about the future of the species for one reason or another? Maybe they believe they're going to go to a better place when they die, or maybe their children are going to go to a better place when they die, or maybe they just don't care about the future of the species. What do we do with those people?
Well, I'd like to load them on a ship and fire them into space and let them go and find another planet. But the serious thing is that the fundamental problem is a failure to recognize that we are still deeply embedded in and dependent on nature. That without nature, we won't survive. That's why when I began to hear reports that pollinators like honeybees were suddenly vanishing, that was the most frightening report I've ever heard. Because if all of the pollinators disappear, believe me, life on this planet will change, we won't survive, and the whole terrestrial ecosystems will be transformed. So if we don't understand that, and this is why, again, indigenous people talk about plants and animals as our brothers and sisters. Well, as a geneticist, I know they're absolutely right. We share most of our genes with plants and animals. They are our relatives. And surely you treat your relatives with love and respect. If you simply look on them as objects or resources, we're going to treat them in a very different way. But that's a huge educational program. And I'll tell you one of the fundamental mistakes I made. We started the David Suzuki Foundation in 1990. And we started it because the World Watch Institute in the United States had said, this is a turnaround decade. If we don't turn things around in the next 10 years, we're hooped. And so we started, and I said, every cent we raise, we're going to spend it. We only have 10 years. And people right away said, we've got to get into the schools and educate the kids. And I said, we don't have time. We can't wait for the kids to grow up and replace us. Fundamental mistake for two reasons. One is, here it is 24 years later, and we're still doing the same. Those kids would be up voting now if we had started. But the other thing was I didn't realize they were our avenue to the kind of people you're talking about that don't give a shit about the environment. If you can't care about the environment for your children's sake, then I think as a species we don't deserve to survive anyway. I believe children and the love their parents have for them, that is the fundamental Achilles heel that's going to get us to these people.
So get them while they're young, eh?
Yep.
Gotcha.
Now, seeing another young person, I apologize for my language. John was... Just pretend you didn't hear any of those bad words. What's your question?
Well, I'm 10, and I have quite a few parks in my area. Me and my friends love playing in those parks all the time.
Hanging out with what? Oh, good.
And you've been talking about how all the trees are going to... Basically, everything is going to go wrong if we don't try to help out. And I was wondering what me and my friends could do to help.
Oh, well, you can't vote, and the reality is politicians only care about people that are going to vote in the next election. That's not because they're evil or stupid. It's just the reality of the game they play in is that they've got to look at priorities from election to election. Young people like your age don't vote. They don't care unless their parents say something. So my challenge to you is your job is to get two people to be super warriors on your behalf. That's mom and dad. You've got to convince them. They can't just lay back and wait for you to grow up. They've got to fight to get changes that are needed to protect your future.
Thank you.
Yo, Gukwangin, Guklout, Gekla Bella Bella, Nugwa Helsik, Nuchanov, Nugwa Helsikla Gatuas, Nugwa English, Jessica Brown. I just wanted to thank you for your words, and I had a comment that I wrote down because I was a little bit nervous to talk in front of all of you. So you mentioned settlers aren't going anywhere and that we cannot put human confines on nature. Although I believe before we can look to Indigenous peoples for guidance, we must stop looking at the question of land from a dominant viewpoint and just continuing this extractive relationship, this colonial process. We're going to take answers from Indigenous peoples, but we're not going to, I guess, put meaningful relationships into looking at the question of land within BC, which is still hasn't been dealt with. And so I think that it's like that needs to be addressed, like root causes, before we can just look to people for answers and continuing this extractive process. And that's all I really want to say.
If you look at Thomas King's book, The Inconvenient Indian, which I would recommend everybody read, it's a very powerful book. But you see, the thrust of his thesis is that what government has done over the years is get those Indians off the land, because that's been the impediment to the kind of resourcism that is the attitude of the dominant society. And so, you know, for years now, I've been saying to First Nations community, thank you for fighting to protect your culture, because that is the key. And that is going to be a big gift to us, that we are going to need that, that sense of attachment. I thought that the Neil Young concert tour was brilliant, because all he was saying there was, look, you had treaties with the First Nations. Honor the bloody treaties. You're not even doing that. Canada, does Canada mean anything? We have a government now that claims law and order is its highest priority. Well, guess what, Mr. Harper? There was a law that Canada signed called the Kyoto Protocol. Do you believe in law and order or not? He then passed, in his first term, he passed a law mandating that there be elections every 4 years on a set date, and he broke his own law within months. What the hell does law and order mean to this government? And that's what Neil Young raised. You know, even though I believe that land was stolen through these treaties, nevertheless, there were promises made, and is Canada a country that believes in making promises that it lives up to?
Yeah, I agree. I think land is life, and that our words are really powerful, and the way in which we describe these relationships should be looked at really carefully. And so for BC, we don't have treaties, but for the rest of Canada, it's not just up to the Canadian government to honor those treaties. It's up to each individual, because as Canadian citizens, if you want to be proud of who you are, then it's up to you to honor those treaties as well. So it doesn't just come from Canadian government. So I just want to thank you for your words, and I think that you're doing some really great work.
Thank you. So, last one.
This will be our last question of the evening.
David, I admire you for going out and trying to shift our paradigm. But while you're doing that, I would suggest that I think it would be a good idea if we changed our thinking to a profound understanding that we're all in this together. Reasonable ecologists suggest that we're facing the 6th mass extinction. A little look at history indicates that there was an 80% casualty rate in species in the last 5. And the next one will be no different. If you look down the table and see 10 people, 2 of you represent the species that will be left alive at the end of the extinction. Don't worry about saving the planet. Evolution will produce lots of species in about 10 million years. The question is, how can we get people to understand simple things such as we are supposed to live in a democracy. 40% of the Canadian citizens who have a right and a duty to vote don't. They have the power to change our government. Rather than beseeching our government to change, I think we need to beseech the 40% that don't show up to get out and change the government and change our way of thinking.
Well, it doesn't do much good if, even with all of the people voting, 39% vote for one party and that party can be the government. We need to overhaul this system. Democracy didn't just leap into being perfect. I want to remind you, women couldn't vote at one time in our democratic system. First Nations couldn't vote until 1960, someone can tell me. My mother and father, born and raised in Canada, couldn't vote until after World War II. Same with African Canadians. So we never get enough democracy. We always have to fight to get more. I have voted because I knew my parents couldn't vote when they were young. I have voted in every federal election. I have never voted for a party that took power. So basically, my vote was a waste because we don't have a way of proportional representation. And we could elect Mr. Mulroney, even though 2 out of 3 people opposed what he wanted with free trade. We can elect Mr. Harper, even though 2 out of 3 opposed where he was going, because we have a dysfunctional system. So it's not just that Canadians aren't voting. It's that we've got the first past the post system that is really a very highly flawed system. Thank you very much for being here.
It's tradition at this point in the evening that that the host offers a token of appreciation to the speaker for making the journey and the effort and engaging us this evening. And that gift was going to be, as I'm sure many of you know, David's an avid fisherman, was going to be only. Oh, all right, okay. That clears it up. And that gift was going to be a day out on the water in what, being a marine guy, we have boats, but they're all they're all doing science, and they're all up in the Broughton Archipelago doing good work. And so I stopped by a good friend of mine and probably known to many of you, Bob Fermani, who's the owner at Finest at Sea, and I said, Bob, I've got to get this guy out on the water, and can you help me out? And he goes, no, all my boats are out, making a living and doing what they're supposed to do. And well, he goes, well, I think we can do something. So, well, they charter a boat. But he sent this for you.
I prepared to catch it myself.
And a rain check for